1.5. Because that chapter 14, I believe it is, has something else in it. I forget. Impulse control and something else. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Let's get that out of the way because we've got the next package I have for you is sexual disorders, one chapter, schizophrenia. There's a lot of stuff in there. A lot of it is very, very valuable. So I want to get into that right away. And we are dangerously close to the end of the semester. I'm already feeling separation anxiety. Yes. Yes, you might recall it's been too long since I've even talked about it. You're going to take those 3 tests that you will have taken. You're going to study them because 50 questions, that 100-point final, is going to get lifted right off of those tests. Kind of. Because as I said then, do not memorize that the answer to that question is C, or you'll get burnt. Memorize, if you will, or learn the answer and understand why that's the correct answer. You've got 50 questions already taken care of. I think it's an easy final. It's an incentive for you to review in a way that I think is very easy and in a way that helps you. The scores on the final exam tend to be bimodal, very high, and then average. So that tells me that some people actually take advantage of that test, and others don't. I think they do okay, but they don't do as well as they could have if they didn't address those previous 3 tests. Okay. I've also, by the way, gone into Blackboard and hit the right check mark for you to access those tests. I hope that worked. There's no Blackboard, so you have to keep me honest on this. Give me feedback. If it ain't there, it's my responsibility to get it. Those tests you will impact me. Okay? So we're doing this test on Monday because, again, I've already covered mood disorders and suicide, which is a substantial piece of material. You saw, those of you who were here on Monday, you saw all the potential test questions waiting to happen on that suicide material. It just lends itself to the sorts of questions that I think are appropriate and fair when I give them to you on the final. Now, on the test, I didn't mean to say final. So, pardon? Monday's test 3. Yes. Yeah. Did I neglect to say that? No, the test is Monday. Test 3. Yeah. Yes. Right. Hello. I need an alarm clock up here. Yes, this Monday, the 15th, because April's just flying by. And May, I told you, I've got this terrible separation anxiety going on, and I have to make sure that I take good care of my kids before we call this a course. So yes, we only have Monday, and it's perfect because it follows a weekend that you don't have anything else to do but prepare. So, all right, okay, enough nonsense now. Let's move on. And I think this, yes, question. What is the test going to be about? It's going to be on those 2 chapters. Mood disorders, suicide. That's one of the chapters. Eating disorders. We're going to cover that today and Friday. Eating disorders. Minus the other 2 topics covered in that chapter 14. What are they? One of them is impulse control. What's the other one? Oh, that's ice coming out of this. Not a decomposing cockroach. All right. That's correct. Monday, April 15th. I'll put an announcement on the board just in case you all feel more favorable to the written rather than the spoken word, okay? I will put an announcement on there today to make it real clear that you are having a test on Monday. I don't know how else to put that, and I don't have that pill where I can take tonight and speak Spanish tomorrow morning, so I can't do it that way. All right, enough silliness. We were just winding down our discussion of suicide And this is the page. I need to tell you that there are some devious test questions waiting to happen maybe on this page too, because risk factors are important. I have probably covered this at least 3 times that I remember. The idea that risk factors are risk factors. Don't overestimate it. If you have divorced parents, it does not mean you're going to commit suicide. It simply means when you are compared to someone who comes from a quote-unquote intact family, your group of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people have higher rates of suicide within that group. I dare say it would be a very rare instance indeed that someone has committed suicide solely because of the divorce of their parents. You understand it contributes, this is a factor that contributes in an interactive way to many other factors that potentiate the likelihood of suicide and therefore creates these things we call risk factors. Sometimes it's more valuable to talk about them specifically as proportional risk factors. If the rates are higher in one group compared to a reference group, then there is a proportional relative risk. With that preface, let's address these few. The number 1 risk factor has already been covered, and you could all recite that as a chorus in one word. And if I started that chorus now, it would come out from you as, exactly, I heard all 200 of you say parasuicide. Or she is actually, no, your representative for chorus work in this class. All right. So yes, parasuicide, number 1 risk factor. You've tried it before. There's a high likelihood you will try it again. If you've tried it before, there is a greater likelihood that you will complete suicide. Okay? Communication of intent. You hear all the time, well, he's just like, he's talking about committing suicide, but he's always talking about committing suicide or taking his own life, or life isn't worth living, or she broke up with me, so I have no meaning, and blah, blah, blah. And oftentimes, these people get ignored. It's a huge mistake. No matter how histrionic you might feel, the articulation of intent to commit suicide might be, the suicidologists warn us that this is a very high, proportional risk factor for committing suicide. So this is why, indeed, suicide hotlines and mental health professionals will never ignore a communication of intent. And indeed, if it's articulated in the presence of a mental health professional, there's a high likelihood that that patient might not get home that day, because that patient could be hospitalized involuntarily under those circumstances. Pardon? Communication of intent. Meaning, well, there's probably 100 different ways to say that, isn't there? I'm going to kill myself is at probably the top of the list. If communication, the words that are being used, are interpreted by the clinician as evidence of a likelihood to commit suicide, that person can be put in the hospital involuntarily against their own will. Another high risk factor is social isolation. You can see we've talked about social isolation as a risk factor for all of the mental disorders. And from the very beginning, this is why you had such a long introduction to this course, because stuff like that is extraordinarily important. Socially isolated people don't fare well in this world. With regard to mental illness, it is an extraordinarily high risk factor for one of the many mental disorders. We now see it here as a proportional risk factor for suicide. For achievement in school, another reason. Notice that's a real easy test question waiting to happen, isn't it? If I kind of put this into 2 pieces. Poor achievers have a high risk factor, a disproportionately higher risk of suicide, but I can finish that sentence in a variety of ways. The most important one would be now and then people are overachieving. Overachieving, by which we mean exceeding their own ability to perform at a given level because they're working so hard at it. When that happens, there's an associated elevated risk as well. Divorced parents, drug and alcohol, suicide is very often an impulsive phenomenon. And indeed, let's connect with stuff that's going on as we speak in Congress, gun control. And I'm not all that big an advocate of gun control, although when I look at these statistics, I can't help but think as a society it's a good idea. Why? Because if there's a gun in the house, there is a greater likelihood that a homicide or a suicide will occur in that house. It's that simple. Impulsive acts, driven either by anger or by depression, are potentiated by the presence of a firearm. Okay? So then it does make sense to try to control firearm availability, if only for the fact that as we reduce the number of weapons, firearms specifically, in people's houses, the likelihood of grabbing that gun in an impulsive, angry, or depressed state will be reduced. And indeed, will save life, unquestionably. Okay, alcohol doesn't help anything. Alcohol is the great disinhibitor. We will see it emerge again in sexual dysfunction as whetting the appetite, dampening the performance. But it also, as a disinhibitor, makes people do things they wouldn't have otherwise done, as we all know, either vicariously or directly. So it is no surprise then to see that this is a proportional risk factor. Yes, sir. I think very clearly. By the way, I'm going to share something with you and other veterans that I know. Just came out about introducing, in an off-label fashion, psychiatric drugs on the battlefront. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I will share the article with you. Very disturbing data. And there are psychiatrists in the country who right now are saying this is off-label prescription, inappropriate use of these drugs in battle. And I'll share that with you. And anyone else who wants that PDF, I'll just ask for it and I'll send it to you. But I'm sorry, I drifted away from the question. The PTSD connection to suicide is a very real one. No question about it. And as you know, the suicide rates amongst military coming back from these recent conflicts is incredibly high. Some would say inexplicably high. And now this raises all kinds of disturbing questions too. Are they coming back on PTSD automatically slapped on SSRIs because they're young? That potentiated proportional risk of violence to oneself or someone else in this vulnerable group is contributing to this suicide data. Very, very difficult thing to approach. It's very hard data to get our hands on, but somebody's got to do this work. Very, very disturbing. And I can't wait for you to see this article, by the way. It's very disturbing. All right, last but not least, and this is a test question I absolutely guarantee waiting to happen, and that is the whole business of the complexity of college students. Now, I'm not going to take roll call today because you're getting a lot of test questions waiting to happen for being here. I'm telling you flat out what you're going to look at in this question. You can almost make the question yourself. If you're a Valley resident, you go off to the University of Wisconsin, get into your dorm and begin your college career, you have just joined a group that has a disproportionately high risk of suicide. That group is college students who have left home to go away to college, and as they are away, it should surprise no one that there are all kinds of new relationships that need to be developed to establish a social support structure. The usual support structure is, if you will, abandoned and left behind. I don't know if Skype and all of these and FaceTime. I don't know if that's helping this statistic as that statistic gets older. But make no mistake about it, college students away from home, key words, away from home, are at much greater risk of committing suicide. Now, community college students are not in any way revealing disproportionate rates of suicide. So SEC students would show no difference. University of Wisconsin, Indiana University, University of, not Louisville, I was just thinking about them from basketball, but they are an urban university. But you can pick any of those colleges where most of the population in the college is from out of town. Urban universities, i.e. UTPA and the like, who have a very low frequency of students who have come to the university from elsewhere, have community college-like rates, i.e. there is no disproportionate risk in urban universities. Commuter, if you prefer the term, you know the term commuter university. This is technically a commuter university, all right? And you know, the reasons for this should be obvious to you, correct? All of you, not all of you, but most of you, the vast majority of you go home every day. Home is in terms of real home, not dorm room, not apartment with your frat brothers or whatever, okay? So, now, here's where it gets complicated. Complication is that we've monitored suicide here on this campus, and I'm advised by the people who have collected those statistics that the UTPA statistics on rate of suicide is comparable to a University of Wisconsin or any other university that has a high percentage of its student population away from home. When I first heard that, I challenged it. I still have a little bit of suspicion about that statistic because, to me, it flies against the face of everything we know about you as a student population and your demographics. Number one, most of you are living at home. Number two, more than half of you are Roman Catholic. So you have a lot of these buffering influences that, if anything, should show a substantially lower rate of suicide than almost any other university environment. But they say, no, that's not the case. Now, I hope those who have collected those statistics don't have those statistics there to provide money to support the suicide prevention program that we have had on campus. I don't know if it's still in place, but I would like that statistic to be revisited at some point in time because it does not make sense, but you will remember it on the test question as an inexplicable higher proportional relative risk on this campus according to our own data. Okay. That's all for suicide. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it does make sense. And indeed, graduate students would be enjoying lower rates. Perhaps mostly because they're used to the routine. So, you know, it isn't that they didn't know what they were getting into. And by definition, let's face it, too, they're older. On average, they're 4 to 5 years older than, probably the real average is more like 6, 7 years older than undergraduates. And with age comes some degree of protection, at least in the younger years, some degree of protection from suicide potential. So yeah, I think I would be very surprised to find graduate school looking like undergraduate student populations with regard to that risk. So, yeah. Okay, on to another college phenomenon. Some would say an epidemic on college campuses. The eating disorders, and they're being massaged in DSM-5 to include now binge eating disorder, where you overeat 2 or 3 times a month. You achieved Axis 1 mental illness status. So I think they've now just about got the whole population under the net of mental illness. But more importantly, and what we're going to spend all our time on today and Friday, is this alarming rate of eating disorders on college campuses. Most notably, bulimia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa, however, is also encountered and is present on this campus, and I know for a fact that a psychology major a few years back on this campus died from anorexia nervosa. So it is here. This is considered, if you will, a hotbed of eating disorders by virtue of it being a college campus. But my understanding, and I haven't seen the raw data on this, but my understanding is that, at least with regard to bulimia, it is even more frequent on high school campuses these days. That would not have been true a few years back. So it is nothing more than to say that this is being seen in a younger and younger group of students. Oh, I guess I wanted to start with this. This is one of those YouTube things that I think is so interesting. I don't know how they did this, but I want you to see it because it connects with a lot of things that I'm going to say in my subsequent deliberations about these often baffling. I saw eating disorders before there were inpatient units. Whoa. Pardon? I don't know, but I'll put it online if you want it. Oh, it is online. Sorry. Where is it online? Blackboard. You have this. Did I put these online? Are these lectures online? Yeah. So just go to there, and there you've got the link. I don't know how they did that, but it's really, I think, so interesting because that is not an exaggeration. And I'm here to tell you, I treated anorexia early in my career, before the advent of inpatient units. And I found them to be, as a psychologist, maybe even more so as a father, and with palpable paternal instincts, I found these disorders to be so frustrating because of exactly what you just saw in that picture. No matter how emaciated the patient becomes, that's what they see in the mirror. That's what they feel they look like. That's what they perceive themselves to be in terms of their body image. And as long as that's the case, it is an extraordinarily difficult disorder to treat. Fortunately, later in that part of my career, an inpatient unit for eating disorders was established in a new hospital that had just been built in the community in which I was practicing, and I was happy to refer these young ladies. I never saw a male anorexic. They are out there, but I can tell you I saw several anorexics. I saw multiple bulimics, but in no case did I treat a male under those conditions. So I was referring these folks, especially anorexia, to this inpatient unit. And I just communicated with the guy that built that unit. He's still there, still doing it 25 years later. Still at it. Anyhow, here are the eating disorders. We're going to talk, as you probably already got the impression, mostly about anorexia and bulimia. I'm going to give you a couple of patients that you'll have to remember on test day that reveal how difficult these disorders are treated. You can see that the under consideration for the next edition of DSM is a nightmare come true. That is to say, it is now, as of May, a binge eating disorder. So if you're overeating 2-3 times a month in the restaurants you go to or whatever, enjoy your lack of mental illness until May. On May, you become officially mentally ill. That doesn't tell you something about the problems of diagnosing mental illness and its relationship to real medical disorders. I don't know what will. Okay, so forget this restricting binge purge type, purging type, non-purging type. I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. I can tell you from experience, these cases almost always have mixtures of both. However, excuse me, bulimics cannot have, by definition, anorexia. Anorexics are almost always bulimic as well. A while back, we considered the term bulimorexic because they were so often connected. But bulimics cannot be anorexic because, I'm talking about the diagnostic terms, because anorexia, by definition, must include a weight loss exceeding 85% of expected weight. We'll get to that more in a minute. Bulimics, I'll say this now, I'll repeat it again. Test question waiting to happen. Bulimics are almost always at or above normal weight. Now you might say on the surface of that, then that says, so why be bulimic? It doesn't work. Another spin on that would be that if they were bulimic, maybe they would be even heavier. I don't know. The take home on this, and you know, I have this fantasy that I carry around that there are really things you hear in this course that you will remember beyond May 5th or 6th or whatever our test is, and this is one of them. These are extraordinarily dangerous practices. They are associated with sudden death, and I am talking not just about anorexia, but about bulimia as well. The electrolyte imbalances created by regurgitating food and all of the other methods that are used to purge are associated with cardiac arrhythmias that can eventuate in what is called sudden death. All right. Anorexia nervosa, I call it somewhat of a misnomer because in the real medical circles of the medical people, family docs, internists, they've always used the term anorexia as a loss of appetite. It's a common medical term to describe the condition under which someone has lost their appetite. So a depressed patient could be anorexic in some sense of that term. But now, because anorexia has become a well-known diagnostic entity, that term is falling out of favor just as a medical descriptor. But anorexia, in anorexia nervosa, rarely denotes the person has lost their appetite. I never had an anorexic tell me I'm not hungry. They are, in fact, in the business of avoiding food and anything that reminds them of food. I was puzzled by one anorexic, one of the first anorexics that I saw. I'll tell you a little bit more about her before we're done on Friday, who told me she doesn't watch television and she does not read magazines. And I thought, what the hell does that have to do with anorexia, right? Well, since then, I've noticed, and things haven't changed, that the vast majority of commercials on TV are for high-fattening foods. That's probably an exaggeration, right? Because actually the vast majority are for drugs. But most of the commercials that really grab people's attention are they making food look really, really good. That was her reason for not watching television and magazines. Now when you think about it, I looked at Cosmopolitan, and yeah, There's a lot of food-related stuff, perhaps more in Red Book than Cosmopolitan, but in a lot of these magazines, just loaded with food, fat food stuff. So this is one of the features of anorexia, the avoidance of food and anything that reminds the person of food, because you see, at the core of anorexia is the restriction of food intake. And that's only partially true in bulimia. Okay. They are obsessed with control over their weight. They've not lost their appetite, is the point here. So in a way, anorexia nervosa is kind of a misnomer. This is a test question waiting to happen. Hey, how many plus points did you got just for showing up today? At least 3 already, right? Test question waiting to happen. The highest rate of mortality, and I think I mentioned this very early in the course in passing, the highest rate of mortality of any of the Axis 1 mental illnesses is anorexia nervosa. 10% will die. It's an extremely, that is so far off the curve relative to other Axis 1 disorders that the second place finisher isn't even close. Highest mortality rate of any mental illness, anorexia nervosa. Would that be pardon? I don't know what the second place is. Probably depressive disorder or bipolar. So yeah, but the others are clustered, is my point. The others are clustered down in here around second place. Let's put it that way. Anorexia nervosa is off the curve. All right. No Karen Carpenter. Who's heard of Karen Carpenter? Wow. It's still, in some people's minds, alive and well. Karen Carpenter died in 1970-something. She became the poster child for anorexia nervosa. She was a partner with her brother in a group called the Carpenters. They made very beautiful harmony and music. And indeed, she died from anorexia nervosa, or shall I say, from complications of anorexia nervosa. I happened to be in a conference where I was presenting on the same circuit, on the same part of the program with a psychiatrist, and he shared with me, it was shortly after she died, that sooner or later it would come out that in fact she died of an overdose of Ipecac. You ever heard of Ipecac? How many people have heard of Ipecac? Used to be in the medicine cabinet of every family back in the day, and now, because it's an emetic, that is to say, this is a drug over the counter that you take, and when you take it, you will vomit immediately. That's called an emetic, E-M-E-T-I-C. Now, they don't have it in medicine cabinets anymore because there are too many poisons these days, which, when regurgitated, absolutely destroy the esophageal tract. So, nonetheless, back in the 70s, it was readily available, and anorexics were using it for bulimic exercises, bulimic purges. So, now, how did she die of a drug that causes you to vomit? This is what my point was earlier. You vomit, you dehydrate. You know that with babies, it's even more scary because on top of that, they have fever, they vomit, they get dehydrated. You have to keep them hydrated, or it can be quite dangerous to brain function. Well, in the case of an adult, the biggest danger is to heart function. Okay, so a lot of vomiting creates dehydration, and dehydration causes electrolyte imbalance. The heart gets irritable. When the heart gets irritable, you can be here today, you can be here at 11:05, you can be gone at 11:06. That's how fast that process works. Okay, so you'll remember then too that Karen Carpenter, not Kim, Karen Carpenter actually died of an overdose of Ipecac. But we call that a complication of the disorder that she struggled with, anorexia nervosa. Nobody even heard of it. I was around in those days. Nobody even heard of this disorder. But because she was a celebrity, it hit the television and everywhere, and the public learned about the disorder, and it increased in frequency and prevalence dramatically as a result. Now, either it increased in prevalence because people were more likely to diagnose this, which I don't believe that was the case, or it increased in prevalence because, as one brilliant anthropologist put it, when certain disorders are publicized and the public is now aware of them, they grasp at these disorders to express their own personal distress and dissatisfaction. I look on the on your supplemental reading list for Ethan Waters. We want to read a brilliant, absolutely brilliant book. He addresses this with eating disorders, with schizophrenia, with PTSD, and with depression. And that's the story that I told you about the Japanese not having a word for depression in their vocabulary. You know that? Okay, so I don't know. I don't know if he's right. I suspect that he might be right. That it's not like a copycat stuff, but it's like this is an expression of my distress. All right, here are the diagnostic criteria for anorexia nervosa. They're pretty straightforward. Another test question waiting to happen. How many is that already now? That's got to be 5, right? Now, all you got to make sure of is that you remind me of those 5, because you know I have this memory disturbance. Okay. Refusal to maintain body weight greater than or equal to minimally normal weight for age and height. Now, this is tricky business. You're all going to have to be math majors for this question. I can either say the person is 15% below what they're expected to be, or I can say they are at 85%. If I say they're at 86%, I wouldn't be so cruel, would I? If I say they're at 86%, would they be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa? Technically not. But, you know, the truth in the real world is that nobody sits there with a calculator when you're dealing with anorexia nervosa. Usually, just like the lady you saw in that video, the diagnosis you can make at 40 paces. If they're not hiding it, and they will hide it. If they're not hiding it, it's pretty easy. Most of them are below 85%. One patient I'll talk to you about, or I've described to you, is a patient who came in on a frame of 5 foot 6 inches tall at 87 pounds. And was she difficult? I'll talk to you about her. Very, very interesting case. So, all right, get that message, 50% below. This is not a criteria for bulimia, only for anorexia. And this can only be accomplished, by the way, with food restriction. That's why bulimia doesn't work. And bulimics don't get anorexic because you cannot use that method to drop weight that fast. But it will enhance food restriction if you combine it, and most anorexics do, tragically. Intense fear of gaining weight, becoming fat, even though underweight. I thought that's what that picture not give you that sense, even more pathologically so from a perceptual standpoint, because you saw what she looked like, but she really was seeing room for improvement. You saw her pinching her. She's obviously the person in the mirror. I still don't know how they did that. The person in the mirror is pinching fat. The person in reality is pinching skin. Okay? No matter how, and this is something very frustrating if you ever worked with anorexia, very frustrating to sit and listen to someone tell you they could still lose more weight. Some will say, I still have some substance in the abdominal area, slight bulge, of which I'm a good example, by the way. But in anorexia, it's obviously they're really stretching it. You can be almost a skeleton as a woman without losing that slight fat tissue around that area of the abdomen. It's normal physiognomy of being a female. And another source of frustration that these young ladies would say, I still have more fat to get rid of. And indeed, that's happened in my office. And I just want to grab these young ladies by the shirt collar, and because sometimes it's hard to be a clinician, but you're always a father kind of thing, I guess, and I can get in the way of good judgment at times. But nonetheless, it's so frustrating. You almost want to think, are they delusional? I mean, is this perceptual problem to a point where it's almost hallucinatory? Is this a psychotic disorder? Everyone who's treated anorexia has asked those questions. Because the presentation you get from anorexia is often nearly psychotic. in terms of the articulation of the patient about who it is that they are. So that's number 3, obviously. Disturbance, perception, weight, size, shape, denial of the seriousness of the problem. People are flirting with death and bulimia as well, flirting with death moment to moment, and denial of any seriousness to the problem. You'll hear about a bulimic I'm going to tell you about, who will illustrate how disconnected they are from appropriate motivation for doing something about their problem, and how that underscores complete disconnect from the issue of impending harm, in which in bulimia has a couple ways of being harmful. Regurgitating, purging, can cause esophageal ulceration. That is a life-threatening situation if an ulcer in that area of the body perforates. So, very frustrating area of dealing with this problem. Postmenarchal females, amenorrhea for at least 3 consecutive menstrual cycles, and if the person is on hormones to sustain their period, they are still by definition anorexic because they are amenorrhea. If they are not having a normal period, i.e. not induced by drugs, then they will consider to be amenorrhea. Now, why I have this question to remind me of something here. Oh, okay, that first one is self-explanatory. One must remember, and I think this is maybe a little bit of a complicated part, but if you will, the complexity anchors on the psychological issues of maturity in these females so frequently. And here's the point. I'm trying to address that double asterisk footnote here. There is an interesting connection between the return to the premenarchal state emotionally, and indeed I and many people who have written about this disorder will say, I'm dealing with a child here most often in the conversations I'm having in psychotherapy. Now what does this all mean? The best predictor of the menarche is body fat to muscle ratio. So, if you're following this logic here, as a woman matures and develops normally, in order for them to reach that, if you will, mark of the beginning of womanhood, there must be the presence of a significant fat to muscle ratio. And this is why, inadvertently and unrelated to any psychopathology, that these kids that start out doing track 10, 11, 12 years old may in fact have a delayed menarche. Okay, because they're not allowing that fat muscle ratio to proceed, which is part of the precipitation of the whole menstruation life cycle. So, that may sound like a completely unrelated physical phenomenon. And it would be if it were not for the fact that when you deal with anorexia, you will hear someone who indeed is denying their own sexual development physically. And in so doing, grasping and clinging to a time of life that cannot continue. That is a time in life when that level of maturity that one has or has not achieved causes a further sustaining of the dependence on the nurturing, keyword nurturing parent, who more often than not, with cross-cultural variation, is mom. And the relationship between anorexics and their mothers with regard to psychopathology is palpable. And I will return to that as well. So all that to say, you see in these young ladies a resistance to growing up to being an adult, the most important signal for which is the onset of the period and the sustaining of the menstrual period. Okay. Oh, that's the same video. So you got twice. I think I've sometimes elected to do it after that part rather than before. I'm not going to hold you responsible for anything on this slide. Some people have speculated that you may have a restricting versus a binge eating purging type. And I just can tell you, you cannot sustain anorexia purging. You will die from a cardiac event before you achieve the level of weight necessary for the diagnosis of anorexia. We'll start with this and finish with my case reports on Friday. So thanks for being so attentive.
Se quedaste dormida. Ya le dije a mi mamá, ya me contestó. Como el cuarto para las 3.
¿Hasta qué hora tienes tu clase?
Hasta las 12:30. 2.